In the annals of Canadian history, few events stir as much emotion and debate as a conflict that arose in 1885. Called the Northwest Rebellion or Resistance, depending on perspective, it was a tumultuous chapter where the dreams and grievances of a people clashed with the unyielding tide of a young nation's ambition. As we will discover this time on Uncovering Lac La Biche, a voyage into history. The Northwest Rebellion of 1885 reflected growing tensions between the Canadian government, the Métis, and some First Nation groups. Central issues were land and resource distribution, seen as highly unjust by the Métis and worsened by diminishing buffalo herds. Government indifference and the Catholic Church's influence in Métis communities escalated the animosity. Here enters Louis Riel. Previously leading the Red River Rebellion, he became pivotal in mobilizing for their cause. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, signifying increased settlement and displacement of Indigenous peoples, further compounded these issues. By March 1885, the lands of modern-day Saskatchewan and Alberta braced for conflict. The rebellion intensified as Riel's negotiations with government failed, amidst broader oppressive policies towards Indigenous peoples. These factors, along with empathy from some settlers and an international focus, sparked the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. A defining moment in Canadian history. It should be noted that no matter how you feel about Louis Riel, the Métis and Indigenous have been dealt a poor hand, with government stacking the playing field further. It shouldn't come as any surprise to you that the Indigenous people here in Canada could not take the ill treatment any further. Our story begins in the mid to late 19th century, with the transfer of Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company to the Government of Canada. This transition, which overlooked the Indigenous and Métis populace, stirred fear among these communities. Emerging as a leader in these uncertain times was Louis Riel. Charismatic and resolute, Riel with a few Métis and Indigenous allies captured Upper Fort Garry in 1869, which at the time served as the administrative center for the Red River Colony. Riel demanded representation in the Canadian Confederation for the Métis. He established a provisional government, enacting laws to protect francophones and Indigenous people, laying the groundwork for what would become Manitoba, a province that has now elected an Indigenous premier, which I'm sure would have made Riel quite proud. This also made Riel one of the fathers of Confederation, and again, this might come as a surprise to some of you, as it's not generally taught in Canadian civic or history curriculum. The situation reached a fever pitch with the execution of Thomas Scott at Upper Fort Garry. A Canadian ultranationalist, Scott was known to hold anti-French and Indigenous sentiments, and had no problem voicing these thoughts in the presence of his captors. Scott and a group of others were involved in an armed scheme to take back the fort. When this failed, everyone just went home. However, a group was sent from the fort to round up the perpetrators, and Scott was among those captured. Scott was already well known to Riel and others in the provisional government well before his execution, as many had run-ins with him before the start of the resistance. His execution outraged many in English Canada, particularly in Ontario. Not helping matters was the fact that Riel had not ingratiated himself with the federal government, nor had he taken a seat once within Parliament. He was thought to be an upstart and all-around troublemaker. Scott's execution did not help his reputation, but rather increased demands for Riel's capture. If there ever was a political blunder, it was executing an incarcerated man without adequate due process. To play the devil's advocate, Scott was not granted a jury of his peers before his execution. Rather, he was tried and executed by a firing squad at the fort's east gates at the orders of Riel, who may have been tired of Scott's constant threats against his own life and that of others. More to Scott's defense one last time, Scott was not present in the courtroom to plead his case when the death sentence was passed. His charge was ultimately for treason against the new provisional government and its peoples. I'm sure Scott was under the idea that he would be released in a prisoner exchange all but up to the moment of his execution, as Riel was known for releasing political prisoners when the mood struck. Historians are usually split on how they view Thomas Scott. Now, if you ask this historian, Thomas Scott was a deeply flawed man, with deeply flawed views of those who were different than him. These same views which brought him into constant conflict with others. Now, with all that said, it's important to note that descriptions of him are often one-sided. Regardless, all can agree that his death was an all-around blunder by Riel. Shortly after Scott's execution, or murder, again, really depending on your perspective. The Manitoba Act of 1870 received royal assent in the federal parliament. Riel's arrest warrant came about the same time, both for Scott's murder and for being the leading figure during an open rebellion that came with bloodshed. Riel, now branded a murderer, fled the province he just created to live a relatively quiet life in Montana as a school teacher. Now this ends the Red River Rebellion of 1869 and brings us to the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. Following the Red River Resistance, many Métis, feeling marginalized in the province that they just helped create, migrated further west. But the 1880s brought new challenges: the vanishing buffalo, the difficult transition from hunting to farming, and growing discontent with treaty negotiations being the most prominent. In 1884, Riel was beckoned back from the United States from a self-imposed exile to a discontented population at Batoche. He crafted a petition and a revolutionary Bill of Rights, but Ottawa turned a deaf ear. When all attempts at talks proved to be ultimately fruitless, the Métis began to take matters in their own hands. When people are angry and left unheard, they often take the more radical approach. Louis Riel would try his hand again at forming a provisional government, a tactic that has proved successful for him before. On March 19, 1885, the Provisional Government of Saskatchewan was formed, and they called for all Northwest Mounted Police in the area to disarm and surrender. When this did not happen, a more direct approach was decided. On March 26, 1885, Dumont's forces clashed with Canadian authorities near Duck Lake. Recently appointed military leader by Riel, Gabriel Dumont, a leading figure in the new Provisional Government of Saskatchewan, employed superior tactics to outmaneuver and outfire the Northwest Mounted Police. These early successes galvanized many Métis and Indigenous peoples to join Riel's cause. Now back to the first battle of the rebellion. Over 2 kilometers from Duck Lake, Dumont learned of a large mounted police contingent moving to intercept the provisional government, and they swiftly moved to intercept them in return. Gabriel Dumont and his Métis soldiers quickly established a perimeter ahead of the police and constructed defensive lines. They prepared for the imminent confrontation. The subsequent 30-minute battle, involving a cannon, a destroyed cottage, and many upturned sleighs, left dead on both sides. Regardless, the Northwest Mounted Police beat a hasty retreat, and Gabriel Dumont claimed victory. Around this time, the Plains Cree, under Chief Big Bear, unsuccessfully sought government concessions for better treatment. When this was denied, a few Plains Cree military leaders adopted a more militant stance. Spurred on by the victories of Dumont, these leaders, namely Little Bad Man and Wandering Spirit, fired on citizens attending church at Frog Lake. 9 people died in the massacre. Big Bear would be blamed for these deaths, but it's important to note that he had largely lost control of the band at this point. The Frog Lake Massacre heightened anti-Riel sentiments in English Canada and increased fear of Indigenous peoples. By late spring, Riel's mental state showed strain. His life, marked by stress from conflicts, political challenges, and exile, likely affected his psyche. While there were indications of bipolar disorder, evidenced by reflections of parish priests from his younger years and a few sanatorium stints in his adulthood, it's important to remember that modern interpretations of Riel's mental health are sometimes speculative. The burgeoning psychiatric field of the 1800s is not the same as it is today. By now, Riel was beginning to see himself as both a spiritual and national leader of the Métis, telling those around them he had divine appointment and was in communion with a higher power. He began to see himself as a second coming, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for all of Canada. He was well known to ride into battle with just a cross pointed outwards as his sole means of self-defense, famously so at the Battle of Batoche, much to the consternation of Dumont and others. While not the epicenter of these turbulent events, Lac La Biche did not remain untouched. Throughout the month of April, the residents of Lac La Biche remained fearful that the small village would be the site of conflict. An emissary of Big Bear arrived at the mission to ask for goods, for ammunition, and a respite for Métis and Indigenous soldiers. Many in Lac La Biche were not enthusiastic about joining the budding conflict or taking sides. Many in the town were content to fish, to farm, to continue their lives as they always had. When the mission refused to help, many in Lac La Biche, that's Métis, that's Indigenous, that's settlers alike, they all wanted to keep an air of neutrality. Because of this, the Hudson's Bay post was seized. The director of the post, having fled to Edmonton sometime before, forgot many of his wife's dresses and belongings in his haste to escape the town. Most of these dresses were stolen, and the rest shredded by the post's newest benefactors. Fears of violence loomed large among the residents of Lac La Biche and the mission, and many homes were taken to looting. Reports from the Edmonton Bulletin in April 18, 1885 reads, "It is feared that Lac La Biche has been taken. As no news has been received from there from some time, Bishop Farad, the bishop for the region, and the bishop who lived at the mission, noted in his journal that panic was general. Enemies could be seen everywhere." He sent word requesting help for soldiers from Edmonton, which lay over 200 kilometers away, to return the town to some semblance of order. By May 6, Big Bear's warriors had moved on. The St. Albert Mounted Rifles arrived in June, a month after the conflict had ended. Likely held back by the haphazard road cisterns in between Edmonton and Lac La Biche of the day, in what I'm sure could be a lively metropolis over frontier debate. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, resolute in quashing the revolt, dispatched Major General Frederick Dobson Middleton to the west by early April. Despite Gabriel Dumont's astute military tactics, the Métis and their allies would soon be overpowered by the well-supplied and numerous government forces. These troops would be ferried along by railway, portage, horseback if they were lucky, and largely by foot if they were not. A pivotal moment in the rebellion, or resistance, again, really old depending on perspective, was the Battle of Batoche, fought between May 9th and 12th of 1885. Here, approximately 300 Métis and Indigenous soldiers, led by Riel and the technically astute Gabriel Dumont, faced off against a force of 800 men under Major General Dobson Middleton. Despite their courage and Dumont's military acumen, the Métis and their allies were ultimately outgunned and outnumbered. Now, wars of the day were won on logistics, by how much ammunition you could supply a soldier, and how much food you can fill them with. By the end, Dumont's army was throwing rocks and eating less. The defeat at Batoche marked a decisive turning point in the rebellion, leading to the eventual capture of Riel and the collapse of the Métis resistance. The rebellion's end saw Riel's capture on May 18th of 1885. He was tried for high treason and controversially executed November 16th of the same year. His death and that of 8 Indigenous leaders, who died soon after, marked a somber close to a conflict that profoundly impacted Western Canada's political and emotional landscape. Poundmaker and Big Bear, who had both had large roles to play within the resistance and were already elderly men by the time of their capture, would be jailed and released after a year of incarceration. Big Bear would die soon after from health complications, likely from the treatment or lack thereof during his incarceration. Dumont fled to the US and avoided capture. He was briefly employed as a sharpshooter in a traveling show. He largely spent his time in exile in the US, giving speeches in defense of the Métis and campaigning for their rights. He would die at the age of 68 in May of 1906, a fighter for the betterment of Indigenous peoples until the end. In English Canada, Riel's execution was seen as a necessary action against a traitor, while French Canada and Indigenous viewed him as a martyr unjustly condemned. This dichotomy in perception marked a deep cultural rift in the young nation and still marks it to this day. In the aftermath, the government moved swiftly to assert control. New electoral districts were established in the Northwest, and the Scrip Commission addressed Métis land claims. However, the Métis often misunderstood the long-term value of their new lands, leading to widespread sale to speculators. The Canadian Pacific Railway played a crucial role in the government's response to the conflict. Its ability to transport troops quickly contrasted starkly with the months-long effort during the Red River Rebellion. This efficiency not only bolstered support for the struggling railway, but also helped fulfill Prime Minister John A. Macdonald's vision of a transcontinental Canada. The legacy of the rebellion and Riel continues to be felt here in Canada. The Riel House in Manitoba, Louis Riel's mother's home, and his final resting place at the St. Boniface Basilica are sites of historical and cultural significance, especially for the Métis community These locations, alongside the Louis Riel Trail, serve as enduring symbols of a complex and significant chapter in Canadian history. Wilfrid Laurier, future Prime Minister, reflecting on the rebellion, remarked, "Had I been born on the banks of Saskatchewan, I myself would have shouldered a musket to fight against the neglect of governments and the shameless greed of speculators." In stark contrast, John A. Macdonald's inflexible stance was clear. "He shall hang, though every dog in Quebec bark in his favor." Such were the polarized views that defined this turbulent chapter in our history. The conflict of 1885 raises a poignant reminder of the complexities and struggles that shaped our nation. From the tranquil shores of Lac La Biche to the tumultuous plains of Batoche, history's echoes resonate, informing our present and guiding our future. The conflict is still heavy in many hearts across Canada. There are many who still regard Riel as a hero of the people and a father of Confederation. The treaties and negotiations that were created before and those that would arise because of this conflict would have far-reaching impacts that can be felt until today. We will discover that and so much more here on Uncovering Lac La Biche. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.